Hey, what are you doing here? Been watching people a while.
I'm eating lunch. That a problem?
Don't get smart. I asked what you're doing. Hand me some ID.
Am I being detained or is this voluntary?
Stand by. Just answer the question.
Before I do, you should know I'm the department psychiatrist.
At 12:14 p.m., under fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of a strip mall HVAC unit, a man sat alone with a sandwich and a folded notebook. He wore plain clothes, no badge, no uniform. Minutes later, a patrol car idled outside. A radio crackled. A decision was made. By nightfall, reputations were bruised, careers were bending, and a department would begin a reckoning it never saw coming, because the man eating lunch was a police psychiatrist, and the suspicion aimed at him would cost $680,000. Stay with this story not for outrage, but for clarity, for how a single stop reveals the invisible machinery of bias, procedure, and power. Listen closely. The truth lives in the pauses between words. The restaurant never expected to matter. It was the kind of place people forgot as soon as they left vinyl booths cracked from age, a soda fountain that hissed louder than it should, a television mounted too high in the corner cycling through muted cable news. Noon had already passed, but lunch lingered in waves. Office workers with badges clipped to their belts. A delivery driver scrolling his phone. The smell of oil, bread, something sweet reheated too many times. Dr. Elias Monroe sat alone, back to the wall, the way habit taught him. Not fear, awareness. He had learned long ago that rooms spoke before people did. He listened with his eyes, the way a man's knee bounced, the way a woman flinched when silverware clattered. Today, nothing unusual, just quiet. He unfolded his sandwich carefully, napkin squared, notebook beside it, no markings on the cover, no badge, plain clothes by design. The department encouraged it blending in, helped him observe officers without triggering performance. He had spent the morning at headquarters, debriefing a patrol unit after a high-stress domestic call, reminding them of cortisol curves and tunnel vision, of how quickly certainty could masquerade as threat. Now lunch. 20 minutes. Routine. It says for Anbren, subscribe via backed. At 12:14 p.m., outside the glass storefront, a patrol car slowed. The officer hadn't been dispatched for lunch surveillance. He was rolling through his beat, eyes scanning by muscle memory. Training did that constant assessment, threat before context. He noticed Monroe through the window first, not the room. A man alone. Not eating fast. Writing, watching. The notebook lingered in his vision longer than it should have. He circled once, parked at an angle that suggested coincidence. The radio crackled low. No call yet, just a pause. Inside, Monroe felt the shift before he saw it. The subtle pressure change of attention. He lifted his eyes and met the officers through the glass. No expression, just a look held half a second too long. He returned to his sandwich, jaw tightening not from fear, but recognition. He had counseled officers through this moment from the other side of the table. The moment where a narrative begins to write itself. The door chimed. Boots on tile. The smell of cold air folding into grease. Monroe did not turn immediately. He waited. Let the footsteps announce themselves. Let the officer choose his distance. Sir. Neutral tone. Professional. Monroe turned slowly, hands visible without thinking. Years of advising had wired that reflex into him. Yes? Mind if I ask what you're doing here? A question that pretended to be simple. Monroe noted the phrasing, open-ended, not yet a stop. He glanced at the officer's nameplate, the way people do when they want to remember later. Eating lunch, he said. Calm. Measured. No challenge. The officer's eyes flicked to the notebook. Back to Monroe's face. You here waiting on someone? No. A beat. The room seemed to thin. The television murmured about traffic somewhere else. Can I see some ID? There it was. The pivot. Monroe felt it land not sharply but heavily. He knew the law well enough, knew the threshold, knew how often it blurred in practice. He also knew how pride could calcify if pushed too fast. Am I being detained? He asked, not loudly, not softly, just clear. The officer hesitated, a fraction of a second where training manuals competed with instinct. Around them, a woman stopped chewing. A man shifted in his seat. Just trying to figure out what's going on, the officer said. We've had complaints. About me? Monroe asked. Another pause. The radio murmured again, as if to fill the space. Outside, sunlight bounced off the cruiser's hood. Inside, a narrative was forming quietly, irrevocably. Monroe reached for his wallet, not yet opening it. The choice hovered between them, fragile and consequential. At 12:16 p.m., the officer called for a supervisor. Silence followed, not empty, but loaded, the kind that settles before something breaks or bends. The supervisor arrived with the sound of tires compressing gravel and a door shutting too hard. Authority often announced itself like that, accidentally loud. Inside the restaurant, the air had cooled, not by temperature, but by attention. Conversations stayed low. No one filmed yet. It was still early enough for restraint. The first officer stood slightly to Monroe's right now, an angle taught in academy hallways and reinforced in annual use of force refreshers. Bladed stance, hands near the belt, not resting, not raised. The supervisor, a sergeant with silver at his temples, took the space opposite Monroe, blocking the exit without appearing to. What's going on? The sergeant asked. The officer answered quickly, a little too quickly. We got reports of a male sitting here for an extended time, writing things down, watching people, wouldn't provide ID. Monroe listened without interrupting. The phrasing mattered. Reports, plural, extended time, watching. Each word stretched the moment, giving it shape it hadn't earned. The sergeant turned to Monroe. His voice was calmer. Sir, can you tell me why you're here? Monroe felt the familiar duality settle in the clinician, observing himself observe. He noticed his own breathing slow. He noticed how the question framed intent rather than action. I'm on my lunch break, he said. I work nearby. Where exactly? At police headquarters. That earned him the first real reaction. The officer blinked. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but recalibration. And your role there? The sergeant asked. I'm a department psychiatrist. The words landed softly, then spread. Like a spill you don't see until it reaches your shoes. The officer stiffened. You didn't say that. You didn't ask, Monroe replied. Not sharp, not smug, just factual. The sergeant exhaled. He glanced at the notebook on the table, then back at Monroe. You have identification. Well, B O per C. Monroe slid his wallet open now. His credentials were clean, current, issued by the city. The sergeant took them, read them twice. Procedure demanded verification. Pride demanded composure. You understand, the sergeant said, handing them back. We're just making sure everything's okay. Monroe nodded. I do. I also understand the standard for reasonable suspicion. That sentence shifted the room. Not because it challenged authority, but because it named the rule everyone was pretending not to test. The sergeant's jaw tightened. And what's your understanding of it? That it requires specific, articulable facts indicating criminal activity, Monroe said. Not discomfort, not intuition, not the way someone looks while eating lunch. Silence followed. Not hostile, evaluative. The officer shifted his weight. People get nervous when someone's watching them, he said. I watch people for a living, Monroe replied, usually with their consent. A faint smile threatened the corner of his mouth and vanished just as quickly. This wasn't the room for levity. The sergeant glanced around. Anyone here feel threatened? He asked the restaurant at large. No one answered. A woman shook her head. A man lifted his cup and looked away. The sergeant nodded once. Decision made, but too late to rewind the tape. All right, he said. We're done here. But done was not undone. Monroe gathered his things slowly. He could feel it now, the residue, the shift in how he was being seen. He stood, chair scraping softly, and met the officer's eyes. This is the part, Monroe said quietly, where most people don't know what to say. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. The radio crackled again, dispatch moving on without them. Outside, body cameras clicked off almost in unison. Inside, Monroe stepped back into the noise of the world, aware that the encounter had already begun to outlive itself on paper, on video, in memory. The first email arrived before Monroe finished his coffee the next morning. No subject line that hinted at trouble, just a neutral thread, internal affairs intake notification, routed through administrative channels the way rain finds cracks. He read it twice, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed something he'd felt walking out of the restaurant. The moment hadn't ended. It had only changed rooms. By policy, any citizen contact involving a supervisor and a refusal to identify had to be logged. By practice, many weren't. This one was. Someone, perhaps the sergeant, perhaps the officer, perhaps a clerk who sensed imbalance had checked the box. Monroe arrived at headquarters just before 8. Same badge scan, same nods from officers he'd counseled through divorces, shootings, insomnia. But something was different. Conversations paused a beat too long. A few eyes tracked him, curious not about what he'd done, but what would happen now. The interview room used by Internal Affairs sat on the 4th floor, windowless, beige, calibrated for neutrality. 2 chairs, a recorder placed precisely between them. The investigator, a lieutenant nearing retirement, spoke with the tone of someone who'd learned that patience outlasts defensiveness. "Doctor," he said, pressing record, "this is an administrative review, not a criminal investigation." Monroe nodded. He knew the language. He'd taught officers how to hear it without flinching. "Walk me through yesterday," the lieutenant said. Monroe did. Slowly, without adjectives. Timestamps mattered. He referenced the department's field interview policy, Section 3.1, voluntary encounters versus detentions. He described the officer's phrasing, the request for ID, the supervisor's arrival. He didn't speculate about intent. He never did. Intent was a luxury evidence couldn't afford. When he finished, the lieutenant leaned back. "You know this is awkward." "Yes," Monroe said. "It usually is when systems meet themselves." The lieutenant didn't smile. Across the building, the officer wrote his report. 3 pages. Carefully worded. He cited suspicious behavior consistent with pre-operational surveillance. A phrase lifted almost verbatim from training slides. He noted the notebook, the length of time Monroe had been seated, the complaints singular, now pluralized by implication. Supervisors edited for tone, not substance. Legal reviewed for exposure. The union flagged it for monitoring. The file grew without closing. Weeks passed. The incident followed Monroe like a low-grade ache. He noticed it in sessions, officers glancing at him differently when he spoke about implicit bias, about cognitive shortcuts under stress. He adjusted, not the message, but the cadence. Less theory, more silence. Then came the public records request. A local journalist, patient and exacting, had filed it under the state's open records law. Incident reports, body cam footage, dispatch logs. The department had 30 days. When the video surfaced internally, it was quieter than expected. No shouting, no threats, just posture. Pauses. A question asked without necessity. The kind of footage departments fear precisely because it offers no easy defense. Emails multiplied. Phrases like optics and precedent began to appear. Monroe was copied on fewer threads now, not out of malice, but caution. He understood that too. One afternoon, as he left the building, he passed the officer in the hallway. They exchanged nods. Nothing more. The distance between them felt institutional, not personal. The file remained open, and somewhere between policy and pride, it was becoming clear that it would not close quietly. The deposition room was brighter than it needed to be. Fluorescent panels humming overhead, blinds half open to a city afternoon that felt deliberately excluded. Light like this had a way of flattening people, stripping away the theater they relied on in darker rooms. Monroe noticed it immediately. He always did. He sat at the end of the table, jacket folded over the chair back, hands resting loosely in front of him. A court reporter tested her keys. The city's attorney arranged exhibits with the careful precision of someone building a narrative, one document at a time. Across from Monroe, the officer sat rigid, uniform pressed, eyes fixed on a spot just above the attorney's shoulder. He looked younger here than he had in the restaurant, smaller. "Please state your name for the record," the attorney said. The ritual began. Time moved differently under oath. Every word slowed, waited. The officer answered questions about his training, first academy hours, field training rotations, annual legal updates. He recited them cleanly. 800 hours at the academy, 40 hours of legal update per year. Bias awareness modules introduced after a consent decree 5 years earlier. The facts were solid, verifiable. That wasn't where the tension lived. "Can you describe what first drew your attention to Dr. Monroe?" the attorney asked. The officer shifted. He was seated alone for a long period of time, observing people. Writing. Writing what? I didn't know. So the act of writing itself raised suspicion? It was the totality of circumstances. Monroe felt the phrase land like a reflex. Totality of circumstances, the elastic band departments stretched when specifics ran thin. The attorney nodded, then waited. Silence pressed in. The kind designed to invite expansion. The officer filled it. "We're trained to look for pre-incident indicators, such as surveillance behavior. And how long specifically had Dr. Monroe been seated before you initiated contact?" A pause. The officer glanced at his notes. "Approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes, the attorney repeated. "At lunch hour." "Yes." The city's attorney interjected, voice smooth. "Objection to characterization." "Noted," the court reporter said, fingers already moving. When it was Monroe's turn, the light seemed harsher. He felt it on his temples, the faint warmth of it. He answered questions with the same restraint he used in clinical settings, short, precise, grounded. "Did you feel threatened during the encounter?" the attorney asked. "No." "Did you feel you were being detained?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was asked for identification without a stated legal basis, and a supervisor was summoned when I asserted my rights." The officer stared at the table now. Monroe was asked about his work. His role advising officers on cognitive bias, on stress responses, on misinterpretation of neutral behavior. He spoke carefully, not teaching, not accusing, just describing. "I see these moments from the inside," he said. "They're rarely about malice, they're about shortcuts." The room held that sentence longer than it held most. Later documents were marked and entered. Training slides, policy manuals, the body cam transcript, time-stamped down to the second. The video played without sound first, just posture and distance. Then again, with audio. The questions sounded different here, more clipped, more exposed. By the end of the day, no one looked relieved. Not Monroe, not the officer, not the attorneys who understood that truth, once slow walked into daylight, rarely served just one side. Outside, reporters waited, cameras ready but respectful, sensing the tone of the case. Monroe walked past them without comment. The officer followed minutes later, eyes down. Inside the building, negotiations had already begun. Numbers were discussed quietly. Not as punishment, as calculus. The light in the deposition room stayed on long after they left, illuminating empty chairs and a record that could no longer be softened by explanation. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, folded into the department's weekly briefing like an administrative afterthought. No press conference yet. No microphones. Just a memo stamped effective immediately and circulated through command staff before it reached the rank and file. Revised field interview guidelines. Supervisor approval thresholds adjusted. Dispatch language updated to remove subjective descriptors like suspicious, unless paired with articulable conduct. Mandatory documentation for all consensual encounters that escalate to identification requests. Expanded quarterly audits by professional standards. On paper, it looked clean. Necessary. Bloodless. Monroe read it in his office, door half open, the familiar murmur of the hallway drifting in. He noticed the phrasing immediately, the careful avoidance of names, of incidents. Policy never said why, it only said now. Later that afternoon, the settlement was finalized, $680,000. The figure appeared in an email from the city attorney with no adjectives attached, no apology language, no admission of wrongdoing, just acknowledgement, converted into currency. Monroe closed the message and sat back. He felt no surge of relief, No vindication. Just a dull settling, the way something heavy finally stops moving after you've carried it too far. The officer learned about the settlement from his union representative. A closed-door meeting. Reassurances delivered with practiced neutrality. His record would show no formal discipline, but the transfer request he'd filed weeks earlier was approved with unusual speed. Different precinct, different beat. A narrowing of opportunity that would never be described as punishment. When Monroe passed officers in the hall now, some nodded with a new kind of respect. Others avoided his eyes. He understood both. Systems protect themselves by sorting people quietly. Months later, on a gray afternoon that smelled faintly of rain, Monroe returned to the restaurant. Same parking lot, same glass storefront. The television was still mounted too high, the volume still muted. He ordered the same sandwich without realizing it until it arrived. Habit had a long memory. He chose the same booth, back to the wall. At 12:14 p.m., he paused, aware of the time without checking his watch. Outside, traffic moved normally. No cruiser slowed, no eyes lingered too long. He unfolded his napkin. Saturday. Waited. Nothing happened. The absence felt different now, not like safety, but like proof. Proof that the system had absorbed the impact and adjusted its posture, however slightly. Proof that consequence did not always arrive with sirens. He took out his notebook, wrote a single line, then closed it. Across the city, new recruits were sitting in classrooms, watching updated slides about reasonable suspicion. Instructors spoke more carefully now. Not because the law had changed, it hadn't, but because the cost of ignoring it had become harder to dismiss. Monroe finished his lunch and stood. As he left, he caught his reflection in the glass, older by a year, quieter in the eyes. Justice, he had learned, rarely felt like victory. It felt like maintenance. Like tending to something fragile, so it didn't break again in the same place. The booth sat empty behind him. Ordinary, neutral, but no longer invisible.